everybody, it's Kevin here. One thing that I wanted to talk about today was sound modifiers, which I think is a really great tool and a really good way to use Notch and all of its real-time goodness to take live audio input and turn it into interesting visual data. And what a lot of people don't know about is that there are quite a few different ways to process audio in Notch. Most people are probably familiar with the standard low, mid, high sort of processing. But then you also have a few other modes that I find really interesting, like the FFT Texture and things like that, which you can use to make some pretty cool stuff. So without further ado, let's jump into this tutorial. So first things first, open up Notch and let's set up our audio devices. In order for you to capture audio in live, you usually have to pick some type of audio capture device. In this situation, I'm just taking audio from the microphone so that you can see as I talk, it turns into visual data. I like to use a program called Voicemeeter. It's a system that lets me route audio wherever I want on my system, so I don't have to pick a mic and lock it up. I can actually use its internal ASIO system to route things wherever I want it to go. So I use this all the time to route, for instance, some cool music from YouTube onto my current Notch session so that I can listen to it on the speakers and also develop with it. So I highly recommend Voicemeeter if you want to go and take a look. It's a meter with 2 E's, which is kind of an interesting spelling. But I'll add a link below. I think it's really helpful, something you should check out. There's lots of other programs like it, but this is just the one that I'm used to. So we go ahead and select that in audio capture here, and I hit OK. So then if we add what's called a capture sound node, that's the node that will let us then use the basically any audio input and use it to route through sound modifiers and things like that. So if we start adding sound modifiers, we should immediately start to see some values. Note that you have to be playing for something to happen, and actually modifiers won't be active until you route it to something. So for now, I'm just gonna add it into a shape 3D, and we're just gonna scale the size of it. So if we do scale X, scale Y, scale Z, and then I set my sound modifier to multiply, we should start to see something happen here. And as you can see, the sphere right now is scaling based on the sound of my voice. And similarly in the sound modifier, you should be able to see this waveform move up and down a little bit. It's kind of unfortunate that you don't see a history here. That's something I would like to see down the road, but for now you can at least monitor what's actually happening. So right now it's set to band 0, but I could change this to waveform or bass bands, for instance, to get low frequencies. Kind of like in this item that I showed in the beginning, here's kind of 3 shapes that are each scaling to your bass, your mid, and your treble. So we can make something similar here. If we go through this and basically make 2 more copies of the sound modifier, and then if we change one of them to mid, one of them to treble, then we kind of have our low, mid, and high. And if we make some more copies of the shape 3D, we can then do the same thing with these where we control scale. Let's do it for this one as well. Then if we move these over a little bit, I'll move this 0.5 over and this one 0.5 over. I'm gonna just scale all these down a little bit so they're not as crazy. So you can see there we kind of have our low, mid, and treble here. There's some settings you can change in the sound modifiers to make it a little less sudden. So things like spikiness here affect how quickly they kind of fall and rise. Kind of attack and decay do something similar too. So you can tweak these settings to have it react just the way that you want it to. I will often increase my change threshold a little bit so it doesn't pick up every single small noise, but then also still reacts to, volume. Basically that says if you have some volume below a certain level, don't do anything. So the higher you raise this, the less reactive they will be, or less responsive they will be. Decay here adjusts how slow it shrinks, so you can, tune this to get some cool effects. So right there we've got our, basic sound modifier system that most people I think are pretty familiar with. So if we move on and start to look at some of the other ways that we can process audio instead of just doing raw sound modifiers like that, There's some interesting stuff where in cloner systems you can do effectors to process sound. Instead of, imagine if you had to make a sound modifier for every band in here, and even then you're not covering the whole wavelength more than, you know, I think it's 15 bars of the offset. I'm not sure. Not sure why my band EQ is not showing up, but hopefully you have better luck with that one. So if I make a cloner system, I'm going to go ahead and disable this other one for now. But if I make a cloner system of, I'm going to do some boxes here, and they're way too big right now. So there's one cube, and I'm going to turn this cloner into a 3D grid mode. And I don't need any cubes in the Y or the Z, only in the X. So if I just add 10 for now and kind of bring this into a more reasonable range, like 0.5 here, and I add an FFT effector. This is basically a system for manipulating clones and affecting them in the shape of the waveform of the sound that you're capturing. So if I feed in my capture sound to my FFT effector, nothing happens yet because I need to actually add some parameter that it's affecting. So if I want them to raise in Y, you can see that right when I raise this, it's having a reaction already. I'm going to just change my fall off to infinite so that it affects all clones no matter where they are in the system. And if I change this to waveform, that actually doesn't have too much of an effect here. I'm not sure why you can select this. Oh, there we go. So it does have an effect. So band 0 only picks band 0, whereas if you pick waveform here, it processes the whole waveform from beginning to end. You'll notice that when I pick band 0 here, it's only affecting this cube, which is near the middle. And the funny thing about FFT effectors is that they start at 0, so they don't take effect anywhere. Well, they take effect, they loop basically. So what's interesting is that band 0 starts at 0.0, so because some of my clones are negative, they're actually catching the high frequencies here, and I'll prove that by picking, say, band 15. You'll notice that this is the highest band here, and that's the lowest band there. So the funny thing about an FFT effector is it's hard to visually place it. I think a good way is kind of doing what I just did there to figure out where the start and the end is. So if we move our whole cloner system over by 0.25, that'll put band 0 here, I believe. Oh no, band 15 here at 0, and then band 0 now starts right here as well. So they kind of meet at this seam right here. And if I add some more, if I turn this into a waveform and add some more clones, it might give you a better idea of what's happening. So I increase the number of clones, and I could reduce this cloner a little bit more, even the size of this cloner. Let's add even more here. So you can see we've kind of got your traditional sort of equalizer that you might see on a boombox or an old, I don't know, like a graphic EQ of some sort. And you can see that with my voice it's a little hard to tell, but we have our low bands here and then our high bands up here. So that's a really basic way of using an FFT effector. And right now we're just moving them in Y. So you could also do other things like scaling them up in X and in multiple axes, for instance, so they'll grow larger the louder that they get and the higher up they go. If I make that more dramatic, you'll see what happens here. So you can make some cool effects with this by, you know, affecting a cloner system. I'm going to reset that there. And I also like to give them a little flair by adding a color ramp effector, probably my favorite effector, and giving it a color ramp so that we can color the clones based on where they are in position Y. So it's a good way of adding that sort of color control to a graphic EQ. So I'm gonna pick, I don't know, let's do 3 colors here. We'll start with like a dark blue, and then get into a yellow maybe, and then we'll redline it with a red there. So right now it's only going in X here because I need to change this from position X to position Y. And then I think the problem right now is that my scale is too small in terms of how this effect takes place. So if I increase my source scale here, you'll see that as the clones rise in position Y, they start to turn yellow and then red, which is kind of like a nice graphic for that. And then your FFT effector, you kind of have the same controls as earlier, where you can adjust, you know, how sudden things are or how smoothly they go up and down. So we can tweak some of these settings to, you know, try to make that a little less crazy. So again, you have your change threshold there to give some different effects. And if we drop the K a little bit, they kind of settle back down a little slower. So that's a really standard EQ. And similarly, you could apply this style of system to a cloner that acts in 2 dimensions. So if I take this same cloner system and now increase our grid count Z and match that so that we make roughly a square here. I just need to reconnect my capture sound again, as well as my color ramp. And you'll see there it's kind of having an effect across this grid, but it's pretty uniform in depth. So all the clones in the Z direction get affected the same as if it were just the single line that you've got here. So let's say you want to do something a bit more than that. You can actually track some history as to what's happening and do some cool stuff, but that doesn't work with the FFT Effector. As far as I know, this doesn't track any sort of history. So you kind of only get a reaction of what's happening right now and any processing you have on it immediately after the data is collected. So to take this a step further, there's another FFT node called the FFT Texture. And this processes your audio as if it were an image texture. And just so we can get a visual on what that looks like, I'm going to feed it into an image plane here so that we can see what's going on. So that plane was really huge. Let me reduce this a little bit. And I'm also going to rotate it so it lies flat. There we go. So here's my image plane, and if I turn on this FFT texture, you'll see that we actually don't see a whole lot right now, and because we need to feed in the sound before it has an effect. So if I feed in the sound here, you'll start to see that it's producing this texture. We can solo this gradient on its own, and you can kind of see that it makes color based on how loud your volume is for various parts of this. So if we go back to this visual here, I'm gonna rotate this plane so that it's kind of going backwards in Z to give us a little bit of history there. And right now you can see that it's not only tracking what's happening at this immediate moment, but it's actually allowing it to track in history. And again, you have similar controls here of change threshold, decay, things like that. So I might let things linger a little bit longer just so we can see what's happening, and maybe increase the scale of it a little bit so that you get a bit more brightness when it catches a noise. So you can see right there that this, in my eyes, is a lot more interesting if you're trying to process audio into a 3D format and not just affect other parameters. This is much cooler for using as like a displacement texture, which we'll do momentarily, or to affect a cloner system. And obviously this is much harder to process if you want discrete controls of when the bass hits, do this thing, or when the treble hits, do this thing that's very specific. So I think it has its place and purpose, but for making a 3D graphical visual of your audio, I think it's really powerful. So kind of how I was talking about displacement, we can go ahead and try to do that by using a displacement map, and we'll just use another shape 3D here. So if I take a plane, and I'm gonna scale this down a little bit and move this over here. We can use a displacement map to use this FFT texture as an image for processing the displacement of this plane. So you can see that something's happening, but it's a little hard to visualize. So I'm gonna add a material and make this a wireframe, and then we'll start to see what's happening here. I'm gonna scroll down here and check wireframe. And you can see that it's turning our image into an actual displacement of this mesh. So I'm gonna rotate this so that the directions match here. There we go. So you can see here that the shapes that bump out of this plane match this texture over here quite closely. And in fact, I can overlay them if you're really curious here. Let me make sure they're in the same X position. So there we go. You can see that where it's bright, this plane is extruding upwards and producing kind of this landscape thing. And we can increase the subdivisions on this plane to get a little more detail. So you can see there that it's actually quite accurate in terms of how the displacement is moving across this plane. And you can use this method to make some really cool graphics, almost like you're moving through mountains as music is playing or something. So you can see here that it's working quite nicely. Similarly, we could use a texture to indicate, how this plane should be colored, and to give it similar variety as before that you see back here. So for this image plane, we could use a recolor. And I'm going to add, with your displacement maps, you want that to operate off of black and white images. So I'm going to add a video null here for this image plane, and I'm going to feed this black and white texture into our displacement map. That way our recolor doesn't impact how the displacement map is working. So if I give it the same colors, you'll see that our kind of FFT texture below is doing the same thing that we defined over there, where it goes from blue to yellow to red. And over here, we can do the same thing with our material by giving it a color ramp, basically. So we can take a mapping node, and also if we map this video null into its color texture, you'll see that it's actually working in kind of this reversed format. So the color texture right now is not oriented the same way as it, which is why it's not corresponding, but you can see it's reversed in the x-axis. So that's why we add this mapping node, so that we can flip this texture. So right now it's planar. If I rotate this so that it kind of maps on board there, and then also the same way that we manipulated the other one. That's not quite right there. Let's see if it's lining up now. There we go. That's much better. So a little bit of fiddling with the mapping, but a little bit of trial and error will get you there. So now you can see that this plane, if I move it over, is matching what's happening on this FFT texture, but doing an actual displacement. Oh, I see. So when we move the shape, this displacement map, what's happening is that's also moving. So what we can do is, in this inherent transform channels, we can turn off this position X, and actually we can turn off all the positions. And if we go back to our mapping here, we can zero back out the X, and it should line up a little bit closer. Looks like not quite there. We need to offset it a little bit. That's not doing quite what I wanted it to. I think I need to tie this into the shape 3D. Let me zero that out and give this another try. If I rotate this here and then scale it down. So right now it's that same issue of being flipped. And then if I rotate it the other way, there we go. So the problem was that our mapping node actually respects 3D space. So that way, when I move my shape, the mapping node will actually move with it and then map the right colors to the right areas. So that's a little tricky there, but there you have it. We have a displacement that's also using the same color texture. So similarly, if you didn't want to use a displacement, we can use a similar technique with cloners to then clone and have this image affected. So actually I can take this same system that we have earlier. I'll take this same cloner system here. And if I move this cloner system over so that I can see what's happening, we can then route in, or let me delete these effectors that we have here. We can route in an image effector to then take this same image. We're going to take this same unprocessed FFT texture, and that should have an effect with what we define in this image effector here. Right now, nothing is defined. So if we give it a little position Y, you'll see the whole thing is kind of bouncing up and down. And that's probably because, let's see, that's probably because this image effector needs to be, actually, I'm not sure why it's bouncing up and down. Let's see. Color blend amount. I don't want it to affect the color. I want it to just bounce up and down. And then mapping. Oh, I think this one also needs a mapping node. That's right. So the image effector needs to be told again how to map this texture onto what's happening. And by reusing the same mapping node as before, you'll see that we get a similar effect. It's just oriented the wrong direction. So if I turn this you can see here that something very similar is happening, and I think my cloner system isn't the right size. So here we are. This is also affecting our cloner system now. And if we want to color it the same way, we could take the same color ramp effector system and have it, tune the height of these cloners as well. So if we do that here. So now if we feed in this color ramp, it should give it the same coloration here, and you'll see that's exactly what happened. So let me increase the number of cloners a little bit just so we have a little bit more resolution here. And you'll see that the nice thing about the cloner system is you can do some cool things with this image effector. Earlier when I was adjusting the mapping, I was able to get this landscape to kind of rotate. And this is sort of an accidental discovery, but I think this is a really cool effect. So you could do some interesting stuff like this and orient your waveform however you want in terms of how it's marching on this plane. You could probably do something similar with your displacement map here on this plane, or maybe not actually. Displacement map, mapping, video, no. I think you'd have to rotate the video for this one to work. So that is kind of cool about the cloner system. You can keep the cloner in place but rotate the image effector. With your displacement map, it doesn't look like you can do quite the same thing, but I think that's also okay in that you can rotate your video image instead. So if we had a transform image to our FFT texture, this should allow us to do kind of similar things by rotating it around like this, and you'll see it's also working with our image plane over there. So, I think it just gives you a different style. Obviously using this material lets you treat it not as discrete points like this, but if you turn off wireframing, you can actually turn it into a surface that you light and target with shadows and things like that. I won't go into it too much, but you can start to use your imagination to think of what you could do with it. I think one last thing I wanted to show was just using a non-plane system to make something. We take a shape 3D and we make this a torus. And I'll orient in the Z direction and move it over here so we can see what's happening. I'm going to make it a little smaller. So there's our torus. You can also use an FFT mode called FFT Deformer. And what this is exactly what it sounds like. It deforms using FFT, but it's not going to have the history that you have with these other modes. It's going to be a what's happening now sort of deformation. So if we feed in our capture sound node to that, we should start to see an effect there. And we can also give it a color ramp in the same manner. I want a color ramp deformer, right? So if I take a color ramp deformer here, and we can color it using this color ramp, same as before, so we get a visual cue. We can use that, and we probably have to orient this not to texture coordinate, but to distance. Then it'll color that the further it gets pushed outwards. And I'm gonna just increase the scale a little bit here, and then give it a little offset so that the center stays blue, and as it goes towards the outside, it starts to turn yellow. So maybe do like, this needs to go a little further here. So there we go. So as it pushes out, it starts to turn yellow and even red if the volume gets raised high enough. We could probably even raise this further. So we do like, I don't know, 100. Is that too much? Maybe. Let's see, is that, no, that's probably too much there. So as that gets pushed out, oh, that's not so bad. It turns yellow then red. And I'm also going to make this a wireframe just so we can see it a little bit more, what's happening. So I think that's too many subdivisions. I'm going to lower that a little bit. And so there we are. We have this thing that's affecting a circle, but I'm not seeing the effect quite drastically enough. So I'm going to make this a waveform to begin with. And we probably also need to change this deformer transform space to world. And there's a mapping mode here. So we change that to UV. I think what's going to happen is it's going to affect the UVs of this thing in a way that maps along this torus rather than just in a planar format. So right now our waveform should kind of be moving around this thing and bouncing off different areas of it depending on what frequency it is. So that's a good way to use it in a sort of non-planar format. We can decrease this decay a little bit and also the spikiness so that it gets deformed a little bit more as I speak. So you can see that, you can start to use these various FFT systems in many ways to affect objects. And I only went over some possible ways to use it here. I'm sure there's many others if you put your imagination to, do some work. I think in our example here that I showed before, I actually have it hooked up in a way to use these sound modifiers a little more than just sizing up these 3 triangles, but you can use it to drive post effects here. So I have the sound affecting things like glow or film gradient, distortion, or whatever else you want. So you could use this to make some cool textural, abstract stuff as well. So I think the possibilities are endless, and so much of what we do is, tied in with music that you should use your imagination a bit and see what you can make. It's kind of like, brings me back to the Winamp days. If I play some music, we can look at how this reacts in more detail in terms of bass and treble. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm gonna deactivate my mic from this voice meter thing so that it doesn't interfere and give some feedback. And there's a really good YouTube channel of music that I enjoy listening to all the time by this guy, Haluli, H-Luli, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, H-Luli D. He has these sweet photos of BMWs and has some really good mixes on here that I enjoy listening to. So let's play a little bit of this and see what happens here. So you can see right away that it has an effect. I'm basically routing the music in from voice meter, and depending on what frequency it's listening to, you're gonna get some really interesting patterns with this. So right now with a lot of bass, you can see that's all of our low notes. There's a little bit of mid and treble getting mixed in, not a whole lot, just a little bit. So you can see, you can get really close in and get a nice textural version of this. Let me turn off these. So I'm going to turn these post effects off. I find them a little distracting for seeing what's happening. If I skip forward in this mix a little bit, maybe let's get some other noises in here. Skip forward some more. So you can see here, now we're starting to catch other frequencies, and you'll get some really interesting effects depending on the type of music you're listening to and what's happening. So go out of there and play with these sound modifiers, make some cool stuff. I look forward to checking out the things that you create. Thank you, and see you next time.